Okay, all right, everyone. Hello, this is Volts for June 25th, 2025. The fight to build faster in California. I'm your host, David Roberts. California has become the poster child for the U.S. housing crisis. It is over 3 million units short of housing demand at this point, and that number is growing by about 100,000 a year. It is also in danger of becoming the poster child for larger blue state governance challenges. One reason California is so far short of the housing it needs is that it is difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to build anything there. And one reason for that is the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, signed into law in 1970. That law, at least the way that law has been interpreted and expanded since its passage, effectively gives anyone who can afford a lawyer the ability to delay any project they oppose for years. It has been used to block or delay affordable housing, student housing, bike lanes, and high-speed rail, along with lots of plain old apartment buildings. This year, real CEQA reform is on the table for the first time in many, many years. In the state assembly, Oakland Assemblymember Buffy Wicks is sponsoring AB 609, which would exempt infill housing from CEQA review. In the state senate, San Francisco's Scott Wiener is sponsoring SB 607, which would follow that with a number of additional reforms. This topic is, to say the least, controversial among the state's various interest groups. I cannot wait to get into it. I am happy to have Assemblymember Wicks and Senator Wiener here with me today to discuss why this reform is needed, how they have assembled a coalition to support it, and what they hope for California's housing future. With no further ado, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, Senator Scott Wiener, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Excited for this, been trying to set this up for a while. I know you two are very busy in general, but particularly right now, so I appreciate you taking the time. So let's start with you, Assemblymember Wicks. I know...
You can just call me Buffy, by the way. Makes it easier.
Thank goodness. So many syllables. Anybody who follows this, anybody who follows California housing policy is painfully, and I use the word painfully advisedly, aware of CEQA and has no doubt been involved in many fights over it. But we have listeners outside of California, so maybe let's just start with a couple of minutes on what is the law and how has it come to be what it is?
Yeah. So, this law was passed in 1970. It's become a bit of a sacred cow here in California politics, and it was designed really to protect the environment by ensuring that new projects considered environmental impacts and mitigation, which is a very lofty and important goal, especially at that time when we had like orange skies and, very, very limited environmental protections. And so I think the original genesis of it is one that is very noble. It was to stop harmful development, right? But the statute's sort of breadth and, depth of it has expanded over years and has really allowed it to become essentially, a blunt instrument to stop, in this case, housing production, but many other things too. Renewable energy projects, public transportation, climate resiliency projects, all kinds of other things. CEQA is required on all projects, even those, aligned with state and local plans. You have to undergo a pretty lengthy environmental review process at the general plan level for individual projects, for special plans. There's a lot of analysis that goes into our projects. And over time, there's been essentially a cottage industry that's formed around CEQA litigation with law firms that specialize in CEQA challenges to stop projects.
And those challenges are tantamount to saying you didn't review enough, you didn't review properly, you didn't follow the letter of the CEQA law. That's what those lawsuits are all about.
Yeah, and with the effect is that there's years and years and years and years of delay on many projects. And some projects, you'll have a plot of land that is perfect for development, say it's transit-oriented housing or place for multifamily housing, and there'll be a lawsuit that's so involved that the developer will finally just throw in the towel and give up. And then that land won't be bought by another developer to develop it out to a project because they know what they're going to face is years and years of lawsuits. And so thus the reality of the, millions of homes shy where we need to be here in California.
Yes, and it's not just necessarily the lawsuits, it's also just the threat of the
That's right.
lawsuits, sort of like preemptive defensiveness against the threat of lawsuits. Maybe Senator Wiener, or I guess I'll call you Scott now.
Scott is great.
Maybe you could go into a little bit of detail about what are the groups that are filing these CEQA lawsuits and what are they typically using them for?
Yeah, so, and I wanted to just add, the last point you made is incredibly important because sometimes the folks who just reflexively defend CEQA can do no wrong, very little needs to be changed about it. What they will point to is, only a tiny percentage of projects get sued in court under CEQA, so therefore there's not a problem. But what you said is absolutely spot on. It's not just about the actual lawsuits. It's if you know that X opponent of the project has the ability to hire a lawyer or has a lawyer, you're going to be very conservative and err on the side of more and more environmental review to protect yourself from a lawsuit. So it really distorts the entire system, even for projects that never end up in court. And what we've seen is, and just to be clear, there's a chunk of CEQA that is absolutely about the environment. When you talk about building some massive warehouse facility in an area that's going to have mega impacts on the community, or putting a big chemical plant somewhere, or something that could lead to toxics. But a lot of CEQA has nothing to do with the environment. And so we see it play out as really all about leverage. And that's why it's so hard to change CEQA, because everyone who is used to using the law to exercise leverage to get what they want on a project doesn't want to give that up. So for example, recently, maybe a year or two ago, the Los Angeles City Council passed an ordinance to phase out oil extraction in LA. And that passed. And the oil industry filed a CEQA lawsuit against the city of LA, saying that the city had not engaged in sufficient environmental review. So using CEQA to try to stop the phasing out of oil extraction. We saw recently in Napa, north of San Francisco, where they only have one childcare slot for every 10 children who need it. There was a proposed childcare center supported by the city, by the county, broad support. There were neighbors who didn't like it because they didn't want a childcare center nearby. They used CEQA, and there was a lawsuit. Ultimately, it was resolved, but it might have inflicted a mortal wound on that childcare center in terms of cost and delay. We saw recently a CEQA lawsuit against a food bank in the city of Alameda in the East Bay, a CEQA lawsuit against a Planned Parenthood healthcare center in San Mateo County. And the list could go on and on and on about CEQA lawsuits that literally have nothing to do with the environment and that are stopping us or slowing down our ability to create things that we need, like childcare centers, like health centers, like food banks, like moving away from fossil fuels.
This wasn't included in your list of anecdotes, but we should say that often trade unions, will file CEQA lawsuits against projects as leverage to push those projects to offer better labor agreements, basically.
Yes. You see the building trades that will use it to try to get project labor agreements on a project. The hotel workers union has used it to try to have better wages and working conditions for hotel workers. And in a lot of these cases with labor, at times their goals are goals that I support. I want better wages and working conditions for workers. My view is we should just legislate that as the standards and not do it through CEQA. They're doing it through CEQA because that's the way they can do it. There is another way. My view is let's just set up good rules and not have every single project be sort of this bespoke, unpredictable process where CEQA can kill a project or delay it.
Right. It seems like a law that is sporadically and inconsistently enforced via lawsuits is not the best way to solve the problem of labor standards.
No. And also, I think another group that obviously famously uses CEQA are NIMBY groups, right? And I have in my district, I represent UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley was trying to build housing on People's Park, a park that obviously has historic importance, but has become, essentially an open air drug market. They tried for decades and decades and decades. The local neighborhood group, homeowner groups use CEQA to say that by building housing there, the student noise would have an environmental impact.
Yes, I remember that one, the noise of students being pollution under CEQA.
So we had to do a bill that passed with flying colors off the floor of both houses to basically say that student noise couldn't be considered an environmental impact. And now we are building 1,200 units of housing and housing for our unhoused on that land, but it required literally legislation from the state to ensure that.
That's about as close as you're going to get NIMBYs to come to stating their core philosophy, which is just that people basically are pollution.
Right.
But more people.
That was basically the argument, yeah.
So before we get into your bills to reform CEQA, maybe we just talk a little bit about this is not the first go at reforming CEQA. There's been a problem for a while, and there's been these sort of fitful efforts at reform, but they haven't really amounted to anything. Scott, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, these sort of like exemptions here for this and that.
To be clear, there has been good work, and actually, Buffy and I have been part of that work, and it's happened in two ways. What we've basically done is we have taken categories of projects and said we're either going to just create an exemption, so it's simply exempt from CEQA, or do something called ministerial approval, which means there's no discretion about whether to approve the project or not approve the project. And that means that it's not just exempt from CEQA, it's not considered a quote unquote project for purposes of CEQA. So it's like literally as if CEQA didn't exist for that project. And so we've done that for big categories of housing, whether accessory dwelling units or duplexes or certain apartment buildings or commercial conversions to apartment buildings, which Buffy did that law. We've also done exemptions for, I authored an exemption for on-campus student housing. We did one for certain kinds of public transportation and bike and pedestrian projects. There's been a series of these exemptions. And to be clear, exemptions are extremely powerful. It just knocks an entire category out of CEQA. But what that means is that for everything left behind, which is an awful lot of projects, including some kinds of housing or childcare centers or advanced manufacturing or semiconductor plants, the CHIPS Act basically almost entirely skipped over California because it's too hard to set up shop here. It's been a legislative failure that we've not been able to muster the ability to fix CEQA itself. And so we get accused of, you're Swiss cheesing CEQA by doing exemptions. The answer is yes. Okay, let's fix CEQA itself, which is what we're trying to do with SB 607.
And one other thing I wanted to mention also before we get into the laws is, and this is a dynamic, because one of the things I want to talk about later, maybe a little bit, is how this has become politically possible. But one of the dynamics that's going on, and Buffy, maybe you could say a little bit about this, is there's been a series of state laws trying to get housing going. Like this has been a long fight in California trying to get housing going. And at this point now you've got kind of a weird situation where you've got state laws telling cities they have to do things and cities basically using CEQA to tie their own hands. It doesn't seem like a stable legal situation when you have these conflicting laws, basically.
Yeah, we're sort of coming to head on it, and it sort of manifests itself in the current housing crisis that we are in. We've done a lot of good work over the past, 7-8 years trying to expedite streamlining. And, Scott and I have worked a lot on these bills together to bring about more accountability, really more enforcement around state law to ensure that our local municipalities are actually adhering to their regional housing allocation numbers. RHNA is what we call it here in California, and putting some teeth on that enforcement. We're doing a lot towards that end with some of the exemptions that Scott just laid out. And yet CEQA remains a loophole or a delay that can derail those very same projects. And so that's really the challenge, which is why the reforms around CEQA are so critical. And I would argue, I view our housing and transit policy as our environmental policy, right? So from an environmental point of view, like we need infill housing. We should be incentivizing infill housing. We should be incentivizing our public transportation, not making it harder to do those things, not weaponizing things like CEQA to stop that type of housing and that type of transit, which is why, Scott and I are working on his bill and my bill and, the reforms that we're doing in this body of work.
Well, talk about 609 then.
Sure.
AB 609.
So AB 609 is my baby for the year, my biggest lift. I've got two girls, a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, who I love dearly, and I have AB 609, which is like my third child.
Third child, notoriously the most difficult.
Yeah, totally. I mean, my 4 and 8-year-old do give it a run for its money. But essentially what this bill does is it says if this is infill housing that's environmentally friendly, so we have something here called the Cortese list, which is a list of industrial lands and others that you can't build on. But if it's environmentally friendly housing and it's infill, so there's already a footprint there, no CEQA. We're just no CEQA for housing. Whether it's, market rate, missing middle, low income affordable, whatever it is, no CEQA.
So this is like a categorical exemption rather than
It's a pretty big, carve out here on this. And with the idea being that in fact, we should be bending over backwards to make it easier to build this type of housing.
Right.
And as mentioned, there's been so many delays. CEQA gets so weaponized for infill housing, and often infill housing because it is on a current footprint, which means there are neighbors who object to having housing, multifamily housing in their community. And they use CEQA to stop that housing. So this basically, if we get it passed, which I'm cautiously optimistic, though I choose to live in a constant state of fear and paranoia until it gets signed into law, it will be one of the biggest reforms on CEQA if we're able to get it done this year that will, fingers crossed, jumpstart the housing that we need. And again, with the idea around, I believe we should have more protections on our open spaces. Part of why we love California so much is that we have this beautiful open space. Mm-hmm. We should be very mindful of the environmental impacts on that type of housing. But if you're talking about housing on our current footprint, you look at the example in Stevenson Street in San Francisco. It's literally in downtown San Francisco. It's a massive housing project right next to a BART stop. CEQA lawsuits that was on a parking lot, are being used to stop that housing. That would then be exempt from that hurdle.
Yes, and we should say, the housing that gets blocked this way doesn't disappear. It just goes out into the hinterlands.
That's exactly right.
Where it takes much more sensitive land. Is it clear legally what is and isn't infill? Is that a line?
We have definitions of what that is in the bill. And there's we're using definitions that have been used in other government code, but has to have parcels on 75% of it. So it's a pretty clear definition of infill that I think we're pretty comfortable with here in California.
And what about people who worry that you've basically is too broad a brush here, that you're going to inadvertently exempt some stuff that needs review? Do you think that the environmental friendliness checklist, whatever, I forgot the name for it, but you think that's enough to sort of vouchsafe environmental quality?
I think so. And I also think, if we're not building projects like 469 Stevenson, which is 500 units of housing on a BART stop,
yeah,
we're going to have to build it somewhere. So to your point, it's going to go, out into our open spaces where we're going to then have to build more freeways and more sprawl. And 41% of our greenhouse gas comes out of our exhaust pipes, right? So those are our choices here. So I think the adverse is the issue, right? That I would fully support, this type of housing development versus the alternative in terms of what's better for the environment.
Okay, that's 609. Big exemption for basically all infill housing that fits these basic requirements, which is most of it. The other bill is SB 607. That's yours, Scott, your baby.
Yep.
This one is a little bit more, it's funny. It's so technical and freighted and everything. But on the other hand, if you actually read what it does, it's incredibly wonky and technical. It does several things, but there's one main thing I want to focus on, which is about how high a hurdle you have to cross to file a lawsuit, basically, what it takes to get in the door for a lawsuit. Right now, the standard is a fair argument. Is there a fair argument that there might be an environmental impact? And I think anybody listening to this will just be well, I can make up a fair argument for anything. So that's effectively no barrier at all. If you can get anyone to write down an argument, you can get a lawsuit going, basically. So it's, at this point, trivially easy to file these lawsuits. So what would the bill make the new standard, and what effect would that have?
Yeah, there are actually 5 pieces to the bill, and any one of those pieces, if it were a bill by itself, would be a big bill. So we make it easier. Right now, there is this gotcha provision in CEQA where if there's a CEQA lawsuit after an environmental impact report, they look at the administrative record, which is right now defined so broad that you can overturn an environmental impact report in court if they neglected to include some tangential email from some employee 3 times removed who wasn't involved in the decision. So we narrow the administrative record to be only what the decision maker actually saw, which makes a lot of sense and is very exciting for a lot of cities that get tormented by this. There's also a provision if you almost qualify for a CEQA exemption but barely miss it. Right now, that you have to do an environmental impact report as if the exemption didn't exist. The bill would say, in that case, you only have the impact report would only apply to the piece that you missed, not to everything. So it'd be much narrower. And there are a couple other things as well. But the piece you're referring to has to do with the legal standard to defend a CEQA decision in court. So right now, when someone comes forward with a project, or if it's a public project, the city makes an initial decision. First of all, is this exempt from CEQA entirely? And if it is exempt, then boom, you're done. If it's not exempt, then the city has to determine, is there significant environmental impact, or is there no significant environmental impact from this project? If the city decides there is a significant impact, then they have to do an environmental impact report, an EIR. If the city decides that there is not, right at the outset, there's just not a significant environmental impact, then they issue what's called a negative declaration. It's a declaration saying there's no environmental impact. And then that's the end of it. Right now, if you get sued in court, if you do a full environmental impact report and you get sued, the legal standard to defend it is, was there substantial evidence? Was there some credible, good evidence supporting the environmental review that the city did? And as long as that good, reasonable, credible evidence exists, even if someone disagrees with it, then the city wins, the environmental impact report is upheld. However, if the city issues a negative declaration, in other words, says at the very beginning, we are just determining there's no significant environmental impact, it's almost impossible to defend it in court because the standard is different. It's what you mentioned, a fair argument. Can anyone make a fair argument that there actually was a significant environmental impact? And so, for example, if you, as the city or the proponent of the project, if you have 10 Nobel laureates in the area saying there's no environmental impact, and then the opponent finds a community college student who took a semester course in the area who submits a declaration saying there is, then that negative declaration is now overturned in court because someone made a quote unquote fair argument. So what that means in reality is that cities that will say, hey, I don't think there's an environmental impact, we should do a negative declaration, they have to look around. And if they see that there is an opponent out there who might sue, they're going to say, you know what, we're going to do an environmental impact report, which will take years and a lot of money because we can't defend this in court because it's impossible to defend in court. So what our bill does is it says, regardless of what the city's determination was, whether they said that there was no environmental impact, so therefore a negative declaration, or an environmental impact report, it's the same standard. Was there reasonable, credible, quote unquote, substantial evidence to support the city's decision? And that is, like the other changes, it's a significant change in CEQA, and it's a good change.
And so the effect would be that cities would be more inclined to do these negative declarations because suing against them would be much harder.
Right. They would still have to have substantial evidence. And I understand that there are environmentalists and other folks who might say, well, you have some cities that are bad actors and they're just going to say everything is no environmental impact. But if they can't show substantial evidence, if they're just making it up, they're going to lose in court. It's not like it's impossible to defeat that decision. They still have to come forward and show what their evidence is. And if it's bogus, the city's not going to win.
What do you say to people to give them confidence that serious environmental threats that CEQA is still going to apply, that this is not going to be used to smuggle serious environmental threats sort of under the wire?
I mean, a couple things. First of all, outside of CEQA, California has very strong environmental laws, like it's protecting clean air and clean water, endangered species. We have really strong statutes. We have strong agencies that issue strong regulations. We have all sorts of regulations they have to comply with. And again, they still will have CEQA, but cities will still have the ability, if they can show that they have evidence, to not go through a full environmental impact report. So CEQA will still provide protection. It'll be much harder to abuse it. But for real environmental harms, people will still be able to use it in addition to all the other laws that California has.
Mm-hmm. So you think all these 5 changes this law would make, the intent is basically to make it more difficult to do these sort of defensive or frivolous lawsuits?
Yeah, and I should also mention, we also, of course, have building codes and other just rules that people have to follow. But yes, it will cut down on frivolous lawsuits. But I think we also, beyond that, when we talk about the concept of abundance, which has been a good topic of discussion, and I think there was a lot of work happening around abundance before the word abundance was even coined, just making it easier for people and for government to deliver good things that make people's lives better, whether that's childcare or public transportation or housing or advanced manufacturing for jobs, et cetera. We made it so hard that we're strangling ourselves. And so when we talk about abundance, one of the things that we want is government capacity, the ability of government to deliver good things and to be able to give permits for other people to do that without having to go through, unending process and litigation. And so part of this, and this is part of the conflict, is having some level of trust in government and public officials to do their jobs and make these decisions. We elect people to do their job, and let's have some level of trust that they're going to do it in the public interest. And this goes into, there was a great book that came out earlier this year that got overshadowed a little bit by abundance, and that is Why Nothing Works.
Why Nothing Works, yeah.
That was an amazing book, and a great history of progressives, how there was a reaction to the sort of centralized top-down New Deal with some of the abuses by people like Robert Moses, tearing down neighborhoods. And so the reaction was decentralization, infinite process, so that no one's in charge, no one can make decisions, and everything gets decided in court. And that definitely ended the era of top-down, centralized, progressive governance, but it also was the beginning of the housing crisis. It was the beginning of people losing faith in government's ability to do anything, which gave us the grift of Donald Trump, where he said, everything is broken, you're being screwed, and I'm going to fix everything.
I'm not sure if you want to get into this or not, but like one of the other side of the abundance critique is that another effect of that situation is to set up this kind of ecosystem of nonprofit groups who sort of are sustained by these dysfunctions or sustained by these lawsuits, who sort of, who have sort of built their funding model around stopping things from happening. That's sort of how they show their members or their donors that they're doing things is by stopping things.
Well, I'll give you an example, and sometimes it's actually really good intention. So, for example, on this bill, I was talking to a major environmental leader in California, someone who I adore, who I think is just walks on water, and we partner with them all the time on important environmental legislation, who is someone who is, I think, a little more open-minded about some of these issues, who talked about how CEQA is often used in particularly around clean energy, where they go through an EIR on the clean energy. So it's clean energy, which we need, and it has to go through an environmental impact report. So it's delayed and it's more expensive. And then they get something called advanced mitigation funding, which they then use, for example, to do habitat restoration somewhere else or something good.
Yes.
And that if you limit CEQA, it gets harder to do that. My response to that is we should just have a fee or something that generates those funds.
Doing that via courts is just not the most efficient way to accomplish any of those goals.
And I said to her, like, I want you to have that funding. That funding is important. Let's figure out a different way to do it that doesn't tie up things like clean energy in ways that are not beneficial to climate action.
Right. Well, I want to get into a little bit how the politics of this have changed, like why reforms of this scale seem to be possible now when they weren't all that long ago. Buffy, maybe you could talk about the union side of things, sort of like, as we said earlier, they can get good working conditions with the threat of CEQA lawsuits.
Yeah.
And that's very rational, like, from the outside point of view, political economy point of view, like that's a power they have. Makes all the sense in the world for them to try to preserve that power, even though it's not great for the larger public good. So what are you telling them? What are they telling you? What's their current disposition toward all this?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I think the unions are using the tools in their toolbox, right? CEQA is a tool in their toolbox for leverage, and that's why they use it. That's why everyone uses it. That's why the NIMBYs use it. It's why, everyone uses the tool that's available to them and this blunt force instrument, which then the effect of that is, obviously the deficit of housing that we have. And when I talk to the unions, my message is like, wage theft is a problem. We have to address wage theft, right? We need stronger enforcements around. And you look at the construction industry in particular, there's a lot of nefarious actors out there. As some of my friends in the carpenters say, it's a crime scene in a lot of these places. And I think that is accurate, right? The wages need to be higher. Like all those are very valid conversations that need to be addressed. But right now, everyone's using CEQA for that. The California Environmental Quality Act, right, as labor law, essentially.
Yeah. And
I'd rather us go through the front door on the labor conversation and say, actually, let's pass wage theft protections. Let's think about what a residential wage rate can be. All of those different tools in the toolbox that we do with any other type of labor law, we should have that within the confines of labor law.
But why wouldn't they say, and I sort of similarly to like what they might say to Scott, the environmentalists might say to Scott, like, okay, show us that funding, show us that other legislation, and then we'll back off on CEQA. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And I think I will also say the unions are not all monolithic on this. I think you've had unions like the carpenters who I think are way more willing to come to the table and negotiate on what this can look like and what it means. And you have unions who are more, I think, committed to using CEQA in its current status quo, because it's the tool that has worked for them. And I get that, right? Like, again, if it's the thing that's working for you, you don't want to get it taken away. But again, the impact is that a lot of the members of those unions can't afford the roof over their head. And so we have to reimagine how we're doing this here. I would say just on the question of politics too, to me, I'm a Democrat because I believe in government and I think government can and should deliver for people. And so as a Democrat, I think it's important that our government is delivering for people. And when you look at the housing crisis in California and the fact that we have almost 200,000 folks experiencing homelessness every single night, and the fact that, we are 2/3 of the state legislature and every statewide office, like we have to own the fact that like we need to fix this. And the good news is we are now in positions of power to fix it, and we should do that. And that is what we are going to do. But we have to, I think, recognize that. And granted, it's taken us decades and decades to get to this point. And those were decisions made long before I was in office or Scott was in office, right? But we have to fix it.
One of the ways that previous efforts at reform have worked around unions is by when they offer these exemptions to CEQA, they tie them to labor standards, basically. And this is, getting back to the abundance thing, this is what the abundance people call everything bagel liberalism, which is you have a policy where you're trying to get housing and you attach all these other goals to it, all of which might be laudable in their own right, but you end up with a policy that's sort of unwieldy and nothing gets built. And we should say your exemption for infill housing, 609, has no such requirements. It is a plain bagel. Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Your exemption for infill housing, 609, has no such requirements. It is a plain bagel.
It is a very plain bagel right now, yes. And I introduced it that way very intentionally because I essentially just wanted to rip off the Band-Aid and see where everyone came out,
And I'm assuming that unions are upset about it and still opposing.
Yeah,
they haven't changed. They haven't come around on this, basically. That's
the
what I'm
building
asking.
trades are opposed to the bill. I am in conversation with the carpenters union on what that could look like. I'm getting other pressures too to say, okay, well, if we're going to give this exemption, then we need to have a certain amount be affordable housing, right? 15% of a project or whatever it is, right?
Classic bagel topping.
Yes. And so then there's all these other things that come into play, or we have to do mitigations around environmental mitigations on certain projects, or we have to do this, or we have to do that. So all that incoming, I sort of introduced the plainest, cleanest version, and then sort of seeing, okay, who's going to come out of the woodwork with concerns, some of which are very valid, some of which we can address, But my response on, like the inclusionary zoning, which is the percent requirement for affordable in a project, is cities can do that already. They have that in their toolbox. This bill does not touch should there be a certain amount of inclusionary. Some of my colleagues are going to push very strongly to have inclusionary in the bill. But you have to look at what's feasible.
Let me actually put a marker here because I think that's actually important. The city level inclusionary zoning codes are not affected by this.
Exactly.
They can all still do all the toppings on the bagel they want at the local level.
Right. They can still have height requirements. They can still
you're not prohibiting that
right.
at all.
This doesn't touch zoning. This doesn't touch height. This doesn't touch, inclusionary cities can still do that. What this bill does is it says CEQA no longer applies to these projects, which, by the way, CEQA has already been done on the general plan when the cities are putting together their planning. They're saying we're going to have zone for this amount of housing here, and this is what it's going to look like. This is what's going to be available to be built out. They do CEQA on that, on the general plan. They do CEQA on the special plans. So it's already been done. It's just saying you don't have to do CEQA on this specific project.
Right. Maybe this is just my naivete, but why aren't unions swayed by the prospect of lots more construction work? Lots more building. It seems like ipso facto, that would be a good thing for the trades.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. It's what they've used successfully to fight for the things that they believe in, which, again, I share those values. But it means that everyone's then fighting using CEQA to stop the housing that they, don't want in their neighborhood or whatever, right? And so because it's such a blunt force instrument, there needs to be reforms around it. But it's just the tool that has been useful for them. It's how they're getting their project labor agreements done. It's how they're able to get the projects they need. So I understand the desire, but I think we have to go about labor law in a different way than utilizing CEQA for that process.
Scott, maybe you can flesh out a little bit more how the politics of this have changed. Why is this proving possible now? I don't want us to get over our skis here. It's not written, not done and signed yet, but why is it possible now when it wasn't even quite recently?
The politics have shifted dramatically, first around housing, but then around other needs as well. I was elected in 2016. Buffy was elected 2 years later in 2018. And right before I was elected is when there started to be some work happening in the legislature around housing to say we can't just let cities do whatever they want because it became a race to the bottom and it gave us this massive housing deficit. I want to be clear. I think it's important not to demonize cities. And I don't just say that because I'm a former local elected official. I think that there are cities that try really hard, cities that don't. And there are a lot of local elected officials that get it, but feel paralyzed and they don't know what to do. And so around a decade ago is when the work really started to say, let's rebalance this, not to get rid of local control, but to have stronger statewide standards to make sure we're meeting our needs, like around housing. And it was hard at first, but I think one of the reasons why the politics shifted is because the housing disaster that had been playing out in places like San Francisco and Berkeley and Santa Monica and some other places for years or decades started spreading everywhere.
Yeah.
And to the point where even in like the Inland Empire and Central Valley, which historically have been the most affordable parts of the state, people were getting priced out. And so for our colleagues and others, they started seeing firsthand what happens when you don't build enough housing in terms of homelessness, working class families being pushed out. And so it really built momentum. And we also assembled an amazing coalition, yes, of housing advocates, but also of environmentalists like AARP and Habitat for Humanity, the UC Students Association. Buffy played an instrumental role in working with the Carpenters Union to come in an incredibly positive way, and that was a game changer. And they brought other unions with them, like the Laborers Operating Engineers. So we built this coalition. And then as we started passing more housing laws, we started focusing on other things and say, hey, let's make it easier to do this, that, or the other thing as well. And, we have more and more colleagues that just totally get it. And we also have big city mayors that have been supportive. Governor Newsom has been an incredible ally on this work around CEQA, around housing. He's been just terrific. So it's been just a growing movement, and it's working.
I mean, obviously, local city governments are not a monolith either, but are they coming around on this, or
Yes.
do they still largely want this tool in their toolbox?
On CEQA, they have, on my CEQA bill, one of our co-sponsors, and probably the lead co-sponsor of the bill, is the Rural Counties, RCRC, the Rural Counties of California. I'm getting the name wrong. RCRC, they're one of the lead local government groups. They represent all the rural counties, which is most counties in California. And we have the support from all of the local government groups, the League of Cities, the Association of Counties, because they understand, cities and counties, how CEQA ties them up in a knot. And in another bill that I'm doing this year, Senate Bill 79, that upzones for more density around high quality public transportation, where we have a lot of local government opposition, we now have the city of San Diego is supporting it. We're actively working with another large city that shall remain nameless, and various small, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, Culver City have all endorsed the bill, and a whole bunch of city council members around the state. So we're seeing a shift at the local level too.
And I think what you'll see, I have cities in my district who have been really good pro-housing cities. So I definitely think it's, cities sometimes take a bad rap, and there are definitely bad actors, but there's good actors out there. But also what happens, and I know Scott hears this sometimes too, when you go around California, you have some city council members who are like, yes, please keep doing what you're doing, because it sort of takes the control out of their hands. Yes. So that they're not at the tip of the spear at their Tuesday city council meetings, right? They can kind of say like, oh, the state's making us do it, the big bad state.
I can imagine having experienced local control up close for several years running, having a little bit less local control might sound appealing to you.
In San Francisco, I tell our local elected officials, feel free to use me as, if they want to make me, some people in San Francisco make me the boogeyman. San Francisco is going through a big upzoning pursuant to it's a required upzoning, and Mayor Lurie, our new mayor, is doing a great job advocating for it. There was a big hearing on it yesterday, and there were all these NIMBYs who came out and they were like, this is Scott Wiener's upzoning, and I am happy to absorb that, happy to absorb it.
That is hilarious. I mean, it's true. I did have one other question about opinion on this. I'm sort of wondering specifically, this is slightly orthogonal to the CEQA thing, but I'm just curious, like among people, I think, who are empirically educated on housing issues, let's say the connection between homelessness and lack of housing is obvious and straightforward. But my impression, generally speaking, of the general public, I don't know if they make that leap. There's a lot of weird folk theories about what causes homelessness. So I'm just wondering, like, is that argument starting to land? Or is the public starting to make that connection? We need more homes because we've got all these homeless people?
I think so. I mean, I'd love to know what Scott thinks, but people are starting to connect the dots. I think it's because, and especially in the Bay Area where we've been at the tip of the spear of the crisis for so long now, that people understand the reason why we have such a crisis of homelessness is because it is too damn expensive to live in California, and it's too expensive because it is too hard to build anything in California. And so I do think there's a through line there. You also have folks who, folks who are older, who, have been in their house for 30 or 40 years, raised their kids, and their kids have gone off to college, and now they're coming back and they want to live here and they can't live here anymore, and they're going to go somewhere else. And so you have folks who are maybe would tend to be a little bit more in kind of like the NIMBY camp, who are saying, well, wait a second, I want my kids to come back here, and they can't afford the rent because it's just there are not enough homes. And so I think the issue has changed a lot over the last, 10 or so years, because the crisis has metastasized to such a level that it's requiring us to take this kind of political change.
Yeah, I totally agree. On homelessness, I think people do get it, although you have the debate, is homelessness a housing issue or a mental health issue, and it's a toxic debate, and it is largely a housing issue, and of course there's a mental health component to it. But I think for me, in my conversations with my constituents, it's about homelessness, but it's also, like Buffy said, I had an older couple that came up to me about 5 years ago at a community meeting to say, you know what, we always hated your housing work and really didn't want more density in our neighborhood. But now our kids are moving to Chicago with our grandkids, and you were right. Or people who will say, my kid has had 3 teachers this school year because the teachers keep moving away, or they're just my neighbors. I don't have any working class neighbors anymore. It's only rich tech people who can afford here, and no offense to rich tech people, but it's good to have a mix of different kinds of people. And so people see it in different ways that really make it come home for them.
Another, I think, instinctive opinion people have, definitely this is on the left, you hear a lot of this from progressive groups, which is that there's something about housing where the normal laws of supply and demand don't really hold, and that when you just require more housing absent other controls, you get gentrification. Basically, like gentrification is the big, and I should say, to steelman this a little bit, like in a situation of severe shortage, it kind of is true that anytime you make a decently dense area, a lot of people want to live there, and the prices do go up. So like, like empirically, people see that happen. It's not crazy to think that.
Yeah, this is an issue that I've been dealing with a long time. Actually, I think
I can imagine.
My initial, in terms of my initial entry into true YIMBY politics, I had been doing the work, but my first real public thing was I published a piece online 10 years ago called "Supply and Demand Apply to Housing, even in San Francisco." And it sort of went a little viral. So, it's frustrating because we spent 50 years digging ourselves into a hole, not building very much housing and creating this absolutely massive housing shortage. And then we hit a tipping point. And so now we're starting to dig our way out of it. And people have this perception, because we've been talking about this for a while, that an enormous amount of housing is getting built. And we're still not building nearly enough housing. And it's going to take quite some time to dig ourselves out of the hole. But when you have a massive shortage that explodes the cost of housing, and then you build that first or second tranche to dig out of it, that housing is going to be expensive, because you're not going to solve the shortage overnight. And I also try to remind people, yes, the housing that was built a year ago, you call it luxury housing. Well, it's just expensive. But guess what? The flat that was built in 1942 is also super expensive. And one of the best examples that I really like to talk about is that in 2015, there was a ballot measure in San Francisco to put a moratorium on new housing in the Mission District in San Francisco. And their argument was that housing causes gentrification, and that over the last 15 years leading up to then, 8,000 Latino families had left the Mission. which was true. There was enormous gentrification happening in the Mission. Well, guess what? When you look at actual housing construction, the Mission was one of the lowest production neighborhoods in the city. Almost no new housing had been built for the 15 years leading up to 2015 in the Mission, and people were still being pushed out. And so when you don't build housing, that's what pushes people out. But when people see new housing going up and it looks expensive, they get the opposite perception.
Yes. And one other thing, I don't know why this jumped into my mind, but I read one of these letters in opposition to your transit-oriented development bill. And of course, Volts listeners will, by the time they hear this pod, have heard already a pod on Washington's transit-oriented development bill. So they're very trained up in all those issues. But I read one of these letters in response to your transit-oriented development bill that was trying to make the argument that somehow building more apartments near the transit stops would reduce transit ridership. I don't remember the causal. It's one of the craziest paragraphs I've ever read. Some of the arguments you run into from people just who are just kind of going off their feelings on this stuff are really, really crazy.
Well, what that argument is that if you are building anything other than 100% subsidized low-income housing near transit, wealthier people are not going to ride transit. Right. Low-income people are more likely. And yes, low-income people might be more likely to ride. But first of all, as we can see in San Francisco, a lot of middle-class and upper-income people do ride transit. If you provide good transit and people can walk to it, they'll ride it. But second, the idea that is somehow worse than having it surrounded by single-family homes where only like 10 people are able to actually walk to the transit station is just absurd.
And those people are wealthy too, because no one else can afford those single-family homes.
It's called overthinking a problem.
You also hear from the left the idea of like, well, I support housing, but only 100% affordable because that's what the need is. And I'm like, yes, we need 100% affordable housing, but we're not going to subsidize our way out of this problem. We need missing middle, market rate, and all of the above strategy, like a yes to 100% affordable, but also the missing middle market rate. Because I have like teachers in my district in Oakland. You know, they make too much to qualify for subsidized housing, but they can't afford the current market rate. And so the realtors tell them, drive till you qualify, drive east, 2 hours, buy a house there, spend all that time commuting because you want to teach in the district in which you grew up. And that's the choice they have to make,
So before we get past this, actually, Buffy, maybe you could talk about where these bills, 607, 609, where they are in the legislative process, because there's some significance to this. We were discussing whether the governor was going to support these, and it seems he has. So maybe explain like what's happening with the bills.
He announced in May during what's called the May revise, when he's going over his budget goals, that he wanted both these bills in the budget to be voted on imminently.
So that just means they become part of this larger
Exactly.
bill.
Like we'll have what's called budget trailer bill. So these would live in that. The nice thing about putting them in the budget is that they go into effect immediately and they have a higher likelihood of success. The governor's basically blessed these bills. So we're in negotiations now. Separately, we have, I have the bill that's still a policy bill that is sitting over in the Senate. I got it off the floor of the Assembly, I think 67-0, which was pretty shocking, actually. Talk about the politics changing on this, which I think, again, just goes to show that there's a real desire to actually kind of fix the problem here. But, fingers crossed, we get these in the budget here soon and off to the governor's desk.
That means they don't go through the typical committee process too, right? Because it's often these committees where these things die.
Mine has gone through, Scott and mine's bill have a little bit of different place where they are right now, but they've gone through committees in their original houses. So mine went through natural resources and housing. Scott's yours went through, I can't remind me again, the committees.
It was environmental quality and local government.
Yeah. So they have gone through some committee review process. And then the governor made the announcement that he wanted to see them in the budget. So we've been, we're both, negotiating on our bills, trying to get them in good places so they can end up in the governor's budget.
And if they're in the budget, the likelihood of passage is high.
Very, very
just
high.
Because
exactly.
You got to pass the budget.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so that seems like a good sign, too, that Newsom's on board. So I'm sort of curious, Scott, you're talking about this coalition that's sort of been building over years and kind of building success upon success. It's very cool to see really that happening across the country in the YIMBY movement. I've sort of been wondering, kind of whether layering the abundance thing on top of the YIMBY thing is like, do we want that chocolate on our peanut butter? We're doing so well already.
I think,
maybe don't mess with success. I don't know how you feel about it.
To me, YIMBYism is a subset of abundance. It's one form of abundance, and it was maybe the more original high prominence version of it. But abundance is taking YIMBYism and just applying it to a bunch of other areas, and also talking about government capacity. To me, the two dovetail beautifully, and I think it's important to have both.
So this coalition that's been growing now, and as you say, you're moving from these sort of, in some sense, from kind of some pretty piecemeal, sort of very focused reforms to bigger things, structural things. CEQA being the obvious example, the sort of like underlying structural thing that was affecting everything else. I'm curious if you have, Scott or Buffy, sort of like other targets in mind. There's of course, the notorious Prop 13, which is, of course, the ultimate structural, problem for California. As far as I've heard, there's no way to get at that. But I just wonder if you have other targets after CEQA, these sort of like big things that you're trying to think about moving.
I did a select committee on permitting reform last year.
Yeah.
And, it was a bipartisan group. It was bicameral, even though I guess it wasn't supposed to be. I got in trouble for that, but I invited Scott along to be a part of it.
Thank you.
And we had hearings across the state. We did, about 150 stakeholder interviews. And we looked at housing permitting issues, but also renewable energy. I was down in Palm Springs and we did a hearing. This is one example, a transmission line. 12 years in the making, 11,000 page ERI, 70 permits through 28 agencies for one transmission line.
Good Lord.
And I remember a part of the panel was the solar industry. And I said, why are you guys even operating in California? And they were like, we don't know. Texas is building twice the amount of solar as we are here. Renewable energy, climate resiliency, we have to do a lot. We're going to compete with and have to contend with sea level rise. And so even just building the resources for that and addressing that, fire mitigation and all the forest work that we need to do, all of that stuff requires CEQA and many other permits. It's not just CEQA, by the way. There's a whole permitting regime on any of these things that take years and years and years. And so it's a really a larger scale issue that we have to really fundamentally address. And it's not, you can't just go in Elon Musk Doge and take a chainsaw and whatever, all high on ketamine trying to fix the problem. It's like you have to literally have so many different nuanced conversations and understanding the processes and how you can stitch together a better process for this to actually serve your constituents and build the modern California that we need.
Yeah, you'd like your deregulation to be
thoughtful,
just like your regulation,
exactly.
Right?
And with environmental goals in mind. I view this as the right environmental policy to actually do the CEQA reforms that we're talking about. It's not antithetical to it. It's to serve that interest of having the environment work for us in a way that is how we live in California in the year 2025 and beyond.
All right. Well, just so I don't miss any, are there other bills up right now that are of interest on the housing front? Scott, you mentioned SB 79, which would be the transit-oriented development. Are there other big pieces currently floating around?
That's the big housing one for me. We're also doing a bunch of work trying to expand and make permanent a big CEQA exemption we gave to light rail, rapid bus service, bike and pedestrian. We tried to do a permit streamlining bill on heat pumps this year. It faltered, but we're likely going to try again next year. So, and then I have a bill to try to expedite permitting on rail and public transportation projects that have to get 1 million permits from different jurisdictions and utilities and get tripped up, such as high-speed rail, to try to expedite that permitting process so that it doesn't get gummed up.
And I've got a bill to make it easier to do solar on fallowed ag land that no longer has water to resource agricultural needs, which is complicated. But we're working on that to see if we can expedite some more solar. And then, coming out of that select committee, we put together a 22 bill package called the Fast Track Housing Package that includes 609 and 607, but also a bunch of other things like, a universal application that cities have to use for housing projects and things like that to make it easier.
And speaking of that work, I actually am late for a very, very big coalition meeting on one of those housing bills.
Good luck, Scott.
Well, we'll wrap it up. I really appreciate you two coming on. I really appreciate this work, and I appreciate all the work you've done on housing in California. It's so needed and so important right now. So thanks for taking the time, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.